Well, welcome back. We're going to unpack the next events that happened after Fort Sumter. All this is happening rather rapidly, as you are writing down notes rather rapidly as well. But here's what happened. After Fort Sumter had been fired upon by the Confederates, they actually took it quite quickly. The Federal or Union forces were not great enough to properly resist it. In fact, Lincoln had determined that it would take 20,000 guys to actually properly hold Fort Sumter. But he didn't have 20,000 guys there. In fact, he didn't really have many in the Union Army at all. And so Lincoln called for volunteers, 75,000 volunteers, to come from all of the states that were still in the Union, except for those few that had formed this Confederacy. And they were called to not only retake Fort Sumter, but really to put down this rebellion, as it was now openly being called. I was quite curious what this actually did. This call was actually greeted by great enthusiasm by those far north, and particularly by the state of Ohio. Ohio was one of those states that really was anti-Southern, and it's hard to entirely figure out why. There's a lot of cultural reasons going into that one state, but Ohio alone almost submitted enough guys to fill this 75,000 quota in just under 3 weeks. Still, it only took a matter of days to fulfill the 75,000 from all of the states in the North together. But what was curious was that the other southern states who identified themselves with South Carolina, at least in terms of culture, refused to do this. In fact, for example, both Missouri and Kentucky refused to send a single militiaman to help in this. In fact, here's what they said. The governor of Missouri wrote this, or spoke this: "Not one man will the state of Missouri furnish to carry on such an unholy crusade." Or the governor of Kentucky said this: "Kentucky will furnish no troops for the wicked purpose of subduing her sister southern states." In other words, they may have disagreed with South Carolina over secession. After all, states such as Kentucky and Missouri and Virginia and Tennessee had already talked about secession when South Carolina and the others seceded. But they all decided that seceding was not the right move. They all decided it was too radical. It was too revolutionary. They must commit to the Constitution. But once Lincoln told them that they had to give troops and actually support a war against sister states, they all decided that they no longer really had a choice. They could not stay in the Union and remain neutral. In fact, this is when these states of Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia all seceded from the Union. It's quite interesting if you study the voting patterns. Prior to this action of the call for 75,000, they had had votes to secede, but these votes were largely defeated by huge margins of victory. But after the call for 75,000, which was seen as a military move, these states realized that secession was probably their only viable option. In fact, Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland all held conventions to discuss the issue of secession. But the state of Maryland, which was north of Washington, D.C., and would thus make Washington, D.C. in between two Confederate states, Virginia and Maryland, was actually under discussion of secession when federal troops were sent into the legislature, and those federal troops arrested the Maryland state legislature. They would stay behind bars for 2 years. That's how they were stopped from seceding. Now, the Union Army, even though it had the resources of the federal government, many of the leaders of the Union Army, or of the Federal Army, I should say, had gone with the South. Robert E. Lee was one of the most famous. He'd actually been asked to command the Federal Army, but refused. Well, that Union Army, quite curiously, was organized by many veterans of 1848. In fact, this is something that Karl Marx, who published his Communist Manifesto in that same year, remarked that many of the immigrants, in fact, there would be some 400,000 immigrants who would serve in the Union Army, many of them coming over with the worldview of nationalism, actually got the Army together. These are men, for example, such as Brigadier General Joseph Weidemeyer, or Brigadier General Louis Blenker, or Major General August Willich. In fact, we could go on and make a long list of these guys who had led revolutions in 1848 against legitimate governments, who then fled for their lives over here to the great independence that America affords, but then led this Union Army to impose nationalism upon all of the states. Now, another curious thing about the Union Army is the Union Army always enjoyed a numerical advantage. They always had more guys. They always had more factory production. In fact, they outnumbered the South in terms of factory production, what they could make quickly, 10 to 1. They outnumbered the South, for example, in things like iron, 15 to 1, or wheat, 400 to 1. But still, we have to remember the Confederate Army, even though it was fighting something of a Goliath in its enemy, the Confederate Army really was fighting for what they saw as a righteous cause, which was state sovereignty. But more importantly, many of them saw themselves as fighting quite simply for their homes. And so those yeoman farmers, that middle class of the South, was really the people who actually fought this war. And seeing themselves as fighting for both home and independence, they both recognized that they had something worth fighting for and even something worth dying for. That's why the South was able to accomplish so much and why we see so many incredible heroes in the history of the South. Now, one of those heroes we're going to talk about, a man who is still mired in controversy to this day because he went with the South, was Jefferson Davis. Now, Jefferson Davis, who would become the first president of the Confederacy, which actually organized this Constitution almost identical to the United States Constitution. They made a few differences. The president could only serve one term, but it was for 6 years. He could veto just part of a bill, if he didn't like part of it, but liked the rest of it. But they also made slavery something that was always going to be based upon states' decisions individually. They also made it so you could freely leave the Union. They also outlawed things like the tariff. Remember, the South really didn't like that government intervention. Well, Davis is a curious fellow. He was born in Kentucky. In fact, he comes from the same state initially as Abraham Lincoln, and their lives are parallel in certain ways. But Davis became a West Point graduate. He served as a Secretary of War under a president. He also was a great planter from the state of Mississippi. He was known for being a very stable man, someone who was very intense and very willful, yet someone who had a very controlled temper, who was not known to yell, for example. In fact, he was known for his kindness, and many of his slaves spoke very favorably of him even after the war. This is kind of the strange nature we always encounter with the South, is that when you have the good men who happen to be slave owners, which was morally wrong, it's quite possible that you'll find their slaves actually loving their masters, even though they were owned by their masters. That's why it really is the peculiar institution. Even so, Davis was someone who was highly committed to the powers and the limitations of the Constitution. And so he refused to ever override constitutional power. He refused to ever make things, or make his office of president greater than it should be. So he really chose a very different strategy from Abraham Lincoln. However, Davis made a key mistake in strategy, and that was he was so committed to the idea of defending homes that he spread thin most of the Confederate forces to try and defend as much territory as possible. Now, it really was a noble gesture in many ways because he was trying to protect widows and orphans, or trying to protect those who were not involved in the fight directly. But the problem is it ultimately meant that he didn't have a strategy that could actually defeat the numerically superior Union forces. In other words, he probably should have listened to men such as Stonewall Jackson, who advised taking the fight to the enemy, or men such as Nathan Bedford Forrest, who advised that we let the enemy in, we let him get deep in our territory, and then we surround him and cut him off from his supply lines. But even so, Jefferson was a man of principle. In fact, Jefferson Davis said this. He said, "We feel that our cause is just and holy. We protest solemnly in the face of mankind that we desire peace at any sacrifice, save honor and independence. We ask no conquest, no aggrandizement, no concession of any kind from the states with which we were lately confederated. All we ask is to be let alone, that those who never held power over us shall not now attempt our subjugation by arms." So Davis really was a man who understood the basis of justice and authority for this whole war. He quite simply believed that the federal government did not have the authority to use force to actually impose their will upon the South. But of course he knew that if they won, they would do that anyway. Still, that's why he was able to say things like this. "The battle is not to the strong, but whomsoever he willeth to exalt." In other words, it's quotation directly from the New Testament, that God does not actually give the victory of battle to those who are strongest. He gives those to who he wants to give those to. So David was a man who often called for national days of prayer, who often called for fasting and humiliations of the people before their Creator. In other words, he knew that this war would only be won if God so chose to let it be won, which of course he did not. And so Davis and men like Lee and Forrest all recognized even after the war that though their cause had been lost, they still had a duty to be honorable men, and they all lived out honorable lives after the war. In fact, it's a study worthwhile all on its own. Still, we'll unpack these issues further in the next video.